Hi folks, welcome to the tutorial on the mark formula build for grade 7 in the phase 3 area for home language. We're going to kind of race through this one a bit more, as there's been more in-depth discussion on this in the grade 8 and grade 9 version. I have mentioned before as well that it is very worthwhile, regardless of whether you only go up to grade 7 in your school, or indeed if you only go down to grade 8 in your school, to watch the tutorials in the other phases as well outside of your regular realm, just for the purposes of understanding. Yeah, so we're gonna crack on with this. This basically completes a sort of 6-part mini series, if you like, in terms of the fact that the first 3 parts were explanations of the mark breakdown for 7, 8, and 9, without really diving into the formula build part of it. And then the next 3 parts were the actual formula builds for 7, 8, and 9. And if you watch those 6 tutorials and get to grips with them, it will bring an enormous amount of clarity and understanding as to how the mark is arrived at and calculated in SASAMS, and not only from the home language perspective in phase 3, but if you can crack this egg, you can crack them all, because it is definitely the most complex of them. So yeah, let's follow through here. So all right, again, I'm going to quickly replicate what you would see on your mark sheets. So you're going to see a 10 first task or activity, should I say, out of 10 for oral. You won't see the task column itself. And again, the next activity, you will see just the activity, in other words, a mark entry point. We've gone through these discussions in the previous tutorials as to how and why that happens. Then you will see this column here, okay, and you will see this column here, and then you will see this here, okay. And I actually cover in the previous tutorials the slight variance in the grade 7, 8, and 9 in this regard. I'm going to just cover it very briefly here. Essentially, that you see in the grade 7 template that essentially only the term 2 mark, the term 2 oral mark counts, or the term 2 oral mark counts towards the final term 2 mark, and doesn't get included again as happens in the grade 8 and 9 scenario. So you still have these areas here where the term 2 oral mark comes into the little calculation patch, if you like, and the term 1 oral mark comes in. It's automatically pulled through from term 1. A little calculation occurs. The task P1 modeling, which includes both of them, actually weights modeling 1 as 0 or oral 1 as 0, and so actually only the term 2 mark counts. And then what you see is that even though that mark then is pulled into the first segment of task 3, in other words, as if it was going to count again, it's weighted 0. And there's the difference between the grade 7s and the grade 8s and 9s, where the grade 8s and 9s do count this mark again, so the mark counts twice essentially. It doesn't count at all in grade 7. So although this template exists in order, I guess, to match the grade 8 and 9 templates, it's basically telling you that we're not doing it like the grade 8s and 9s, and we don't want this mark to count twice like it does in those grades. And so the 2 tasks out of the 3 tasks within task 6, sorry, I said task 3 earlier, I meant the 3rd task, okay, which is task 6, the 3rd task of term 2, which is task 6. The 2 activities within that, well, the 3 activities within that task, only these 2 count. You can see they count 40 and 40, 60 as towards the 3rd task. Okay, so essentially your formula, again, what we're going to do is we know that there are 3 tasks, there are 3 segments to be calculated, and once weighted correctly, simply added together will give you the final term 2 mark. Okay, so again, let's lay out the 3 segments to begin with. Okay, so we know we're going to be adding 3 segments together, 3 tasks ultimately, if you like. The first mark, you can see is out of 10 and moves across to the task column still as a mark out of 10. Sometimes you see that changes. So we don't need to convert the mark at all, which is great, which means we don't need to round it either. So we simply need to take this mark and convert it to a mark out of 30 so that it's got its weighting. So we're taking the mark, dividing it by the test total, and multiplying it by 30. Okay, and instead of putting our constants in at the end, we're going to do it as we go along this time. So the 6's and 7's, remember, hold the 6's and 7's constant. In other words, these 2 rows here. Okay, so that's going to give you the first mark. Again, the second one is nice and simple in the sense that you've got a mark out of 45, which stays as a mark out of 45 in terms of the task total, and then is converted to its weighting of 30. So again, it's going to be very straightforward. The mark divided by the total multiplied by 30. So we now have 60% of the mark. Okay, and in fact, if you were to take this third segment off and only use the first 2 segments of the report mark and enter marks here, you would see essentially a mark out of 60 would be sitting there. That would be your running total, if you like. So in the third segment, again, we see that we've got only 2 marks now to count. So essentially, we can ignore all of these 3 columns, as we do in the other grades, except in the other grades we recreate this first element of the third task, or task 6 if you like. We recreate it. In this case, we don't even need to worry about it because it's weighted not. We're only concerned about these 2 columns here. So in this third segment, we have 2 elements to it, or third task. So I'm going to put those 2 elements in. Okay. And we're going to be going the mark divided by the total multiplied by the weighting. Okay, and in the second activity is also going to be the mark divided by the total multiplied by the weighting. Okay, and that is going to give us a mark out of 100. But of course, there may well be decimals as the weightings take place for each mark. Just a quick sort of explanation here again in terms of weightings and how they work. And I've explained this before. You can actually see that in these tests, the marks are not weighted in terms of their contribution weighting. In other words, this test is out of 30 and that test is out of 40. So this test has a greater volume, and so you would expect it to be weighted more, but it's not. This test is out of 30 and yet it is weighted 60%. So each, if you like, each little mark in the test out of 30 carries a greater value than each little mark in the test out of 40. That's just a little side thing to understand how these weightings can alter the scenario, or kind of the effect that they have on final marks. So anyway, we're going to round this whole bit off, so let's do that, and we're going to round it to 0 decimal places. Okay, and then of course it's a mark out of 100, so we're going to divide it by 100 and multiply it by 40 to get its mark out of 40. And that, folks, should be the term 2 mark. And what we're going to do is obviously run a little test here concurrently, and then if we've made any mistakes, we can go through that in a sort of live fashion, if you like. It's quite handy sometimes to make the mistakes so that we can replicate some of these things, although I'm fairly confident that I've got this right with the level of practice I've been getting. 37 and 26, let's say. Okay, So there's the mark in SASAMS, so we're going to replicate that on. So these are the mark entry points that you would be seeing. Okay. These three columns would be, you've seen in previous tutorials, I read them out. Okay, so you wouldn't be capturing in them. And this is done in the explanation tutorials, which teachers should really be watching. The explanation ones in particular, not necessarily the formula ones. That's why I separated the explanation of these mark sheets from the actual formula build tutorials. And okay, so we've got 26 here, and we have a mark of 84.6. And then just to make sure that we're actually doing things properly here, let's do another one, and let's say 5, and let's say 13, so we should expect something in the 60s, and so let's go here to 7, and then he gets 28. And we've got a mark then out of, oh, I might have forgotten my constants, so there's another example of 17. I'll explain to you exactly what I mean here. So remember, in order to copy and paste this down, we want certain cells to be held constant and certain cells to iterate. Obviously for the learners it must iterate, so your D9s, I9s, J9s, those must iterate. But for your constants, your 7s and 6s, in other words, your totals and weightings should be held constant. So that's these ones here. Okay. And that would enable you to simply copy the formula down. Just as a reminder, folks, I'm seeing some people make the mistake. When you copy the formula from the formula mark sheet onto your mark sheets, from the formula sheet we've handed out onto your mark sheets, to copy the formula and click in the formula bar on your first one, copy the formula in, okay, or paste the formula in, should I say, press enter, and then copy the first cell, boom, and you can simply drag all the way down and paste into the cells underneath. And as I say, if you've got your constants right and your iterations, the thing should iterate correctly down the screen. And just to confirm, you've got 63.27 and 63.27, so the mark is mirroring the mark. So the next tutorials I'm going to bring out are going to be discussing, for those of you who enter a class mark and an exam mark. For those of you who just do the report mark and only show a term 2 mark on the report, of course you're putting a 2 above that column, and that will transfer through to front office reports. And just a quick thing, for those of you who do the class mark exam mark, you'll be doing a 2 and a 5, and we'll be having to generate marks in here that represent what is the class mark and what is the exam mark, and getting the weightings in set classes correct so that the final mark that is generated does actually mirror the mark that occurs in front office. And I'll be attempting to get tutorials out in that regard as soon as humanly possible. Thank you. That concludes this tutorial.